Employee fired for stealing a jewel. But what she did the next day shocked the millionaire, and had always known that her life would be a struggle. A mother at 25, a wife at 27, and a widow by 38. But nothing, not even the years of hardship, could have prepared her for this moment. Standing in the lavish, polished mansion of Taylor Williams, accused of theft. The room was silent, the tension thick. Taylor, the millionaire who had built his empire from nothing, stood at the front, his piercing blue eyes fixed on Anne. In front of him was the jewel, an expensive necklace, an heirloom that had been in his family for generations. Taylor's voice was cold, slicing through the quiet. "This piece is missing. I want to know who took it," and felt her heart sink. The accusation burned her from the inside out. Her body trembled, but she remained silent, staring at the floor. She knew better than to try to explain herself. Her reputation was already in tatters. She had been working for Taylor for the past 2 years, taking care of his household, cleaning his luxurious mansion, and helping his personal assistant with small tasks. She had done everything right, and yet here she was, standing before him, a thief. Taylor continued his interrogation. He addressed each employee one by one, asking if anyone knew anything. Everyone remained tight-lipped, glancing nervously at Anne, as though the truth of the situation was clear to them all, but not to him. She wasn't one to steal. She couldn't afford to steal. But Taylor's anger was palpable, and she could feel the weight of his eyes pressing down on her, and knew what was coming. It had been her greatest fear, being cast out from a world she barely belonged to. And when Taylor finally turned to her, his words cut deeper than any accusation. "You're fired, and I'll be calling the police." Her heart pounded in her chest as she stood frozen, unable to react. In that moment, everything she had worked for, the fragile semblance of respect, the dignity she had fought to keep, disintegrated before her eyes. They led her out of the house, her hands cuffed tightly behind her back, the eyes of the household staff watching her departure in hushed silence. As she stepped into the cold night, Anne's mind was a whirlwind of confusion. How had it come to this? How had she lost everything in one swift, heartless motion, and sat in the dimly lit living room of her small apartment, Mark's room just down the hall? Her son, barely 10 years old, was asleep. His health had been declining rapidly. Each day a battle, as she tried everything she could to keep his spirits high. But tonight, there was no energy left for hope. Her mind replayed the events of the day, the harsh words Taylor had thrown at her, and the shame of being led away in handcuffs. The silence of the apartment was suffocating, and hugged her knees to her chest, her thoughts consumed by a wave of despair. Everything felt wrong. She had always worked hard, too hard sometimes. She had built her life around providing for Mark, caring for him, but lately, it felt like everything she did was in vain. Her marriage had fallen apart when her ex-husband couldn't handle the burden of raising a child with a debilitating illness. And now this. Her son's illness had been a cruel blow, a reminder of how fragile their world was. Mark had been diagnosed with an autoimmune disorder at the age of 5, and the treatments had drained their savings, and had been left with little more than her dignity and the will to keep fighting. But today, in that mansion, that dignity had been ripped away. As she sat there, staring at the empty walls, the weight of everything became unbearable. She had no family to turn to, no friends who could help her out of this mess. All she had was her son, and right now it felt like even that wasn't enough. She had been so determined to give him the best life possible, but now she feared she had failed him in the worst way. The sound of Mark coughing from his bedroom pulled and from her thoughts. She wiped her eyes, trying to gather the strength to be the mother he needed. She couldn't afford to break. Not now, not when he needed her more than ever. With a heavy sigh, Anne rose from the couch and walked to her son's room. She stood at the doorway, watching him sleep, her heart aching with love and guilt. The medical bills, the treatments, the constant worry, it was all consuming. But she had no other choice but to keep fighting. She had to find a way to fix everything, to get her life back on track for Mark. Because without him, there was nothing left for her. The next morning, Anne's heart skipped a beat when her phone rang. She glanced at the caller ID, Paul, Taylor's assistant. A wave of dread washed over her. After what had happened the previous day, why would he be calling? He must be calling to rub salt in the wound. Or maybe he had some other grim news. And Paul's voice was tight, yet there was a strange softness in it. I need to talk to you. Please meet me at the cafe down the street. It's about your son. Her breath caught in her throat. Her son, Mark. Her heart fluttered in panic. Why would Paul bring up Mark now? Had something happened to him? And felt her pulse quicken as she clutched the phone, her fingers trembling. I can't, Paul. What's going on? Her voice was barely a whisper, the fear creeping up her spine. And just come. Trust me, Paul urged. It's important. The line went dead, and stared at the phone for a moment, trying to make sense of it. Paul had always been professional, and he wouldn't call her without reason. Still, her instincts told her to stay away. But her worry for Mark outweighed everything else. She quickly grabbed her coat, wiping the tears from her eyes. Whatever was going on, she had to find out. The cafe was small, tucked away in a corner. Paul was already there, seated at a booth. His eyes were downcast, but his posture was rigid. He didn't look like someone who had good news. Sit down, Paul said, gesturing to the empty seat, and slid into the seat opposite him, heart pounding in her chest. Why am I here, Paul? What could Taylor want with me after yesterday? Paul shifted uncomfortably. It's not Taylor who wants to talk. It's about the necklace. Anne's stomach churned. The necklace? What are you talking about? I don't think you stole it, Paul said softly. It was planted. We have reason to believe someone framed you. And froze. For a moment, the words didn't register. She couldn't process what she was hearing. Her mind was still back at the mansion, with the cold, sharp eyes of Taylor watching her every move. Someone else? She repeated numbly. Who would do that? Paul leaned in, his voice low. We're looking into it. But there's more. Taylor found out about your son. About Mark. Anne's heart lurched in her chest. What? How? Through a contact in the medical field. He wants to help. He wants to pay for his treatments. All of them. Anne's breath caught in her throat. What? Why? Because he sees how much you're struggling. And he knows you need it. Taylor's not heartless, and he wants to make things right. And blinked, her eyes stinging. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Taylor, the man who had thrown her out, humiliated her, wanted to help her son? It didn't make sense, but she couldn't ignore the possibility. Paul stood up to leave, but before he did, he added, he also wants you and Mark to have a home. A real one, not just an apartment. And sat there, overwhelmed. Could she really trust this offer? Could she accept the help of the man who had ruined her life? For Mark's sake, she knew she had to. But could she live with the cost? Think about it, Paul said, his voice softer now. You have time, but don't wait too long. And spent the rest of the day in a daze. The words Paul had spoken echoed in her mind, but they felt like they belonged to someone else's life. She walked through the motions, running errands, making sure Mark was comfortable, but nothing felt real. Every time she looked at her son, the weight of the decision ahead of her pressed down on her chest. That evening, when she returned home, Mark was sitting up in bed, his book resting on his lap. His tired eyes lit up when he saw her, his face breaking into a small smile. Hey, Mom, he said weakly, his voice barely above a whisper. How was your day? Anne's throat tightened, and she swallowed hard. She couldn't tell him the truth. Not yet. Not with everything hanging in the balance. It was okay, sweetheart, she said, brushing her fingers through his hair. How are you feeling? Mark shrugged, but Anne could see the exhaustion in his eyes. She could feel the weight of it, the weariness of a child whose body was slowly betraying him. It broke her heart. Mom, will we be okay? He asked, his small hand reaching for hers. The question was simple, but it hit and like a freight train. Could she answer him honestly? Could she tell him that everything was going to be fine when she had no idea what the future held? She wanted to lie, to reassure him, but the truth was much harder to face. We will be, she said softly, even though she didn't believe it herself. Things will get better. I promise. Mark smiled, but the sadness in his eyes didn't fade, and kissed his forehead and left his room, her mind swirling with doubt. The offer from Taylor was too good to ignore, but it felt like a trap. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something Taylor wasn't telling her. Later that night, Azan lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. She couldn't stop thinking about Mark's condition. The treatments, the medicine, all of it was so expensive. She couldn't afford it on her own, and without the help she needed, she knew Mark's time was running out. She thought about Taylor's offer, everything he promised. A home, treatment for Mark, a chance for a better life. But at what cost? Could she trust him? Or was it just another way for him to control her? And closed her eyes, taking a slow, shaky breath. She had no answers, only the weight of her son's future pressing on her shoulders. For Mark's sake, she had to take the chance. Even if it meant stepping into a world she didn't understand, she would do it, because she couldn't let him suffer any longer. The next morning, she made her decision. She would take Taylor's offer. For Mark. And whatever came after that, she would face it head-on. The following morning, and woke with a heavy heart, the weight of her decision pressing down on her chest like a 1,000-pound stone. The room felt smaller today, suffocating, as if the walls themselves were closing in on her. She could hear Mark in the other room, coughing softly, the sound a cruel reminder of how little time they had left. Her eyes went to the small desk by the window, where an unopened envelope from Taylor sat. She had left it there last night, too afraid to look at it, to see the reality of what she was about to do. But now, with the weight of her son's future hanging in the balance, she knew that she couldn't run from the decision any longer, and picked up the envelope with trembling hands, tearing it open carefully, as though the act of opening it might somehow change the outcome. Inside was a letter, written in Taylor's formal handwriting, outlining exactly what he was offering. Money for Mark's treatments, a home for them to live in, everything she could ever dream of for her son. It was a lifeline, a miracle. But in her gut, she knew that miracles came with a price. She walked over to the window, staring out at the city below, lost in her thoughts. The streets were busy, people rushing to their lives without a care in the world. But for Anne, there was only the silence of her own thoughts, the quiet ache of her heart as she considered what she had to do. Was she really willing to accept this help from a man who had made her life so miserable? Taylor had humiliated her, fired her in front of the entire staff, and now he was offering her everything she needed for Mark. It felt like a twisted game, like he was pulling the strings just to watch her dance. But she couldn't afford to be proud anymore. She couldn't let her own pride get in the way of saving Mark, and took a deep breath and placed the letter back in the envelope. Her decision was made. She would go to Taylor and accept the offer. She didn't know what would come next, but she knew that she couldn't let Mark suffer any longer. She had to do this for him. With a final glance at Mark's door, and walked out of her apartment, her steps heavy but resolute. She had made her choice. Now there was no turning back. When Anne arrived at Taylor's mansion later that afternoon, her heart raced in her chest, and her palms were slick with sweat. It felt like she was walking into the lion's den, her every step carrying the weight of her son's future. Paul greeted her at the door, his usual stoic expression replaced with a look of sympathy. He didn't speak as he led her through the opulent halls, their footsteps echoing off the marble floors. Everything about this house screamed power, success, and wealth. But to Anne, it all felt like a prison of wealth that she was being forced into. They arrived at the large office at the end of the hall, the door standing open. Taylor was seated behind a massive desk, his posture perfect, his gaze sharp and calculating as he looked up from a pile of papers. For a moment, he didn't speak, just studied, and with a piercing look that made her feel small, insignificant. And he finally said, his voice cold and professional, "I'm glad you came." Her throat tightened, and she struggled to find the words. "I've thought about your offer," she said, her voice steady but faltering. "And I've made my decision." Taylor raised an eyebrow, but didn't interrupt, waiting for her to continue, and took a deep breath before she spoke again, her eyes not meeting his. "I'll accept your help," she said, her voice quiet, but the words felt like a surrender. For Mark, Taylor didn't smile. He simply nodded, his expression unreadable. "You've made the right choice. I'll arrange everything," and couldn't bring herself to thank him, couldn't force the words past her lips. How could she thank the man who had destroyed her life, who had fired her in front of everyone, humiliated her without a second thought? And yet, Here she was swallowing her pride, accepting his offer for the sake of her son. "You don't have to thank me," Taylor said after a long pause, his voice softer than she expected. "You're doing this for your son. I understand that," and lifted her gaze to meet his, searching his face for any hint of deception. But there was nothing there. Nothing but cold professionalism, like a man who had lived in the world of business for too long, who had learned to hide his emotions behind a mask of control. "I'll have the treatments arranged immediately," Taylor continued, standing up from his desk. "And as for the house, I've already made arrangements. You and Mark can move in as soon as you're ready." And nodded, but inside, she felt numb. This was the start of something she couldn't undo. She had crossed a line, and now she was bound to Taylor in ways she couldn't yet understand. She wanted to hate him, to reject everything he had offered her, but the desperation for Mark's survival pushed all of that aside. She needed this. For him. Taylor's eyes softened, just for a moment. "I'll help you, Anne. You won't have to worry about anything anymore." But the words rang hollow to her. She wasn't sure if she could trust him, or if she ever would. But for Mark's sake, she would try. She would try to find a way to make this work. Because as much as Taylor had wronged her, her son's life was worth more than anything else. As she left the mansion, the weight of the decision pressed even harder against her chest. She had accepted his help, but the questions remained. What would Taylor want in return? What price would she have to pay for her son's future? The uncertainty gnawed at her, but all she could do was hope that, somehow, she had made the right choice. And sat in the quiet of her apartment, her hands resting on her lap, fingers still trembling from the ordeal. Mark was asleep in his room, a rare moment of calm for both of them. The treatments were arranged, and the house was set. Everything was falling into place, or so it seemed. But and couldn't shake the unease gnawing at her. Taylor's offer, as generous as it was, felt like a trap. Her heart ached with the realization that she might have accepted a lifeline, but she had also tied herself to a man who had shown nothing but coldness and ambition. Sitting in the silence, she couldn't help but recall the look in Taylor's eyes when she made her decision. There had been no warmth there, no kindness, only that impenetrable mask of control. He had offered her a solution, but at what cost? Would he expect something in return? She had nothing left to offer him, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than what met the eye. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. She hesitated before getting up to answer, wondering if it was just another of Taylor's employees bringing more paperwork or instructions. But when she opened the door, it wasn't one of his men, it was Paul. And Paul said, his voice quiet, as if he too were unsure of his place in this new arrangement. "I need to speak with you." "About what?" she asked, her voice wary, but not unfriendly. She didn't know what he could possibly want, but she wasn't about to turn him away either. He had been kind to her in the midst of everything, the one person who had shown her even a hint of humanity in the mansion. Paul glanced over his shoulder, making sure no one was watching. "It's about Taylor. You need to be careful. He's not someone you can trust, not like that. He's calculating. Always has been." Anne's stomach sank. She had suspected something, but hearing Paul say it out loud made it feel more real, more dangerous. She nodded, the weight of her decision pressing down on her chest even harder. "I know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But I had no choice." Paul stepped closer, his voice lowering even further. "He's offering you a lifeline, yes, but there's always a catch. Be ready for it," and swallowed hard. She wanted to believe that Paul was just being paranoid, that he was reading too much into it. But deep down, she knew he was right. Taylor had always been a man of business, a man who didn't give anything without expecting something in return. And now, and was tangled in his world, whether she liked it or not. "I'll keep that in mind," she said, her voice steady despite the fear rising in her chest. Paul gave her a somber look before nodding, as if to confirm her resolve. "Just make sure you're prepared for whatever comes next. He doesn't do things without a reason," and closed the door behind him, feeling more isolated than ever. She was grateful for the help, but now there was a sense of urgency building inside her, a need to protect herself, to understand the true cost of accepting Taylor's offer. She couldn't afford to ignore the warning. But what could she do now? She had already walked too far down this path to turn back. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the room. Anne's mind raced. There was no going back now. She had to stay vigilant, not only for Mark's sake, but for her own. The future was uncertain, and the price of survival might be far higher than she could imagine. The next few days were a blur for Anne. Taylor's people arrived at her apartment to begin the preparations for Mark's treatments, as promised. Every step seemed to bring her closer to a life she never thought she'd have. And yet the closer she got, the more uncomfortable it felt. There were too many strings attached, too many unknowns lurking in the shadows. On the third day, Anne was summoned to the mansion. Mark's treatments were underway, but Taylor had requested her presence. She wasn't sure if it was a routine meeting or something else, but she had no choice but to go. She couldn't risk jeopardizing what little hope she had for her son. When she arrived, Taylor was standing by the large windows of his office, looking out over the city. His back was to her as she entered, but she could feel the tension in the room. It was as if the very air itself had become thick with expectation. And, Taylor said, his voice neutral, though there was something in his tone that made her nervous. "Come in. We need to talk." She stepped forward, her heart pounding. What now? What could he possibly want from her? "I've arranged for Mark's treatments to continue. As you know," Taylor began, not bothering to look at her as he spoke. "But there's something I need from you in return." Anne's breath caught in her throat. There was the catch. She had known it was coming, but now that it was here, it felt different. More real. She swallowed hard, trying to keep her voice steady. "What is it?" Taylor finally turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "I want your loyalty. Your complete loyalty. Not just to me, but to my company. I need someone I can trust." Anne's chest tightened. She didn't understand. Was this all part of his plan? Was she being drawn into something darker than she had imagined? "I'm helping you, Anne, and I expect you to help me in return. This is the deal." Her world seemed to tilt beneath her feet. The weight of his words crushed her, but she couldn't back down now. Not when Mark's life was at stake. She had no choice but to agree. "Of course," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Taylor smiled, a cold, satisfied smile. "Good. We'll talk more soon." As Anne left the mansion, the world outside seemed so distant. There was no going back, and she was tied to Taylor now in ways she could never have imagined. And the cost of that loyalty, she had yet to discover, and felt the weight of Taylor's words pressing down on her like a heavy cloak. She walked through the mansion's grand halls, her steps echoing in the emptiness. As she passed the luxurious furnishings, the shimmering chandeliers, and the perfectly manicured walls, she couldn't help but feel a strange disconnection. This wasn't her world. It wasn't even a world she could belong to. As soon as she stepped outside into the cool evening air, the contrast hit her. The freedom of the night sky versus the suffocating expectations of the deal she had just agreed to. Her heart raced as she replayed Taylor's cold, calculating smile in her mind. "Your loyalty," he had said. "I want your complete loyalty." Her thoughts swirled in a whirlwind of emotions. She had always prided herself on being independent, on making her own choices, even when they were hard. But now, she was trapped. The weight of the promise she had made gnawed at her, but she couldn't afford to pull back. Mark's health was fragile, and the treatments were costly. She had nothing left to offer but her willingness to comply with Taylor's terms. With every step she took, Anne questioned herself. What had she just agreed to? Taylor's generosity came with a price, and she feared she had just placed herself in a corner with no way out. Would he expect more from her than her loyalty? Was he testing her? The cold wind stung her face as she walked faster, trying to shake the feeling of dread that had settled in her chest. She was doing this for Mark. Nothing else mattered. But the realization that she was now tangled in a dangerous web made her question how far she was willing to go. When she returned to her apartment, Mark was asleep in his bed, his fragile body tucked under the covers. Seeing him so peaceful made her heart ache. She leaned down to kiss his forehead, brushing a lock of hair from his face. She had made a promise to give him the best chance at life, no matter the cost. But as she gazed at him, she couldn't help but wonder, what will be the true cost of this deal? The next few weeks were a blur of hospital visits, treatment schedules, and meetings with Taylor's associates. and felt like she was losing herself in the chaos. Every day, there was a new task to complete, another expectation to fulfill. Taylor's presence loomed over her like a shadow, his demands growing more intense. At first, it had seemed like a blessing, an opportunity to give Mark the treatment he so desperately needed. But as time went on, and began to feel a growing sense of unease. Taylor didn't just want her loyalty, he wanted control. He was constantly watching her, pushing her into situations that made her feel increasingly trapped. One evening, after another long day of meetings, and found herself alone in her apartment. The silence was deafening, and she felt a deep loneliness creep in. She missed her old life, her independence, her sense of self. But those days felt like they belonged to someone else now, and hadn't expected her life to change so drastically. When she had made the decision to accept Taylor's offer, it was supposed to be a temporary solution. She would take the money, make sure Mark received the treatment, and then move on. But now, with each passing day, she was becoming more entangled in Taylor's world. As she stared out the window at the city lights, her thoughts turned to Paul. He had warned her. He had told her to be careful with Taylor, but had ignored him, thinking that her desperation for Mark's health would overshadow everything else. Now, she wasn't so sure. There was a knock at the door. Anne's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't expecting anyone. She opened the door cautiously, only to find Paul standing there, looking as serious as ever. "Can I come in?" he asked softly, and stepped aside, allowing him to enter. She had no idea what he was doing here, but the sight of him made her feel a small sense of relief. Paul had always been a comfort to her, and in this world of uncertainty, his presence felt like a lifeline. "I just wanted to check in," Paul said, his voice gentle but filled with concern. "How are you holding up?" And sighed, feeling the weight of his words. She sank into a chair, rubbing her temples. "I'm not sure anymore, Paul. I've lost myself in all of this. Taylor's demands are growing every day. I don't know how much longer I can keep up with it." Paul's eyes softened, and he knelt beside her. "I told you, you have to be careful. This is all a game to him. You think he's helping you, but he's only making you indebted to him. And the longer you stay in this, the harder it will be to get out." And looked at him, her eyes filled with exhaustion and confusion. "What do I do, Paul? I don't have a choice. I can't turn back now. Mark's treatments are the only thing that matters." Paul's face darkened. "But at what cost, then? You're playing right into his hands. He'll never let you go if you keep down this path." And looked away, her mind racing. She knew Paul was right, but the reality was too overwhelming. What choice did she have? She had already crossed the line, and there was no turning back. "I don't know," and whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't know what to do anymore." Paul's hand gently rested on hers, a silent promise of support. "Just remember, I'm here. You're not alone in this," and nodded, the small comfort of his words barely enough to quell the rising storm inside her. As Paul left, she closed the door behind him, her heart heavy with the realization that no matter what she did, the choices she had made had already set the course of her future. Taylor's grip was tightening, and it had no idea just how much power he held over her now. The air in Anne's apartment felt suffocating. Each morning bled into the next as she navigated the tightrope of her new reality, balancing the desperate needs of her son with the growing demands of Taylor. It wasn't just the treatment she had to worry about anymore. There were meetings, calls, whispers in the shadows that made her skin crawl. She couldn't escape it, even in the quiet moments at home. Mark's health had started to stabilize, but Anne could feel the toll it was taking on her. The constant pressure to keep up appearances, to be the perfect ally, was eating her alive. Taylor had a way of making her feel small, insignificant, and yet she couldn't escape the truth of it all. She was in too deep. There was no going back. Her phone buzzed. Another text from Taylor's assistant. "He needs you at the office in an hour." Anne's hands trembled as she set the phone down. The dread that filled her chest was familiar now, but no less suffocating. She stood up and went to the bathroom, staring at her reflection. The woman in the mirror was a stranger. She had once been confident, resolute, but now she was lost in a world where every decision felt like a compromise. As she left the apartment, her mind drifted to Mark. She hadn't been able to spend enough time with him lately. The treatments were helping, but the emotional toll on them both was greater than she had anticipated. Every moment she spent with Taylor, every sacrifice she made, pulled her further from the life she had wanted for herself and her son. The car ride to Taylor's office felt longer than it ever had before. Her stomach twisted as she approached the imposing building, its glass windows reflecting the cold, sterile light of the city. She had come here hoping for a way out, but now it felt like her only chance was to stay close, to obey, to endure. The thought of what Taylor might ask of her next sent a chill down her spine. When she arrived at his office, his presence filled the room like a storm cloud. Taylor's back was to her as he gazed out the window, his posture as cold and distant as ever. He didn't turn when she entered, but the air shifted as if he knew she was there. "And," he said, his voice low, yet commanding, "I need you to understand something. You think this is just about money, about Mark's health, but it's more than that. This is about loyalty. Loyalty that goes beyond anything you've ever known." And swallowed hard, a lump forming in her throat. Her stomach churned. She had given him her loyalty, hadn't she? She had trusted him with the most precious thing in her life, her son. But loyalty in Taylor's world was a currency that always demanded more. "I've done everything you asked," and said, her voice trembling but firm. "I've kept my end of the bargain." Taylor turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "You haven't. Not yet. There's more you need to prove." The words hit her like a slap. Anne's heart pounded in her chest as the full weight of the situation crashed over her. She had thought the worst was over, but it was only beginning. Taylor wasn't done with her. He never would be. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Instead, she nodded, the reality of her situation settling like a stone in her stomach. She had no choice but to keep playing his game, to survive it, whatever it took. As the days stretched on and felt the walls closing in tighter, Taylor's requests were no longer subtle. They were demands, spoken with an unshakable authority that left her little room to question him. Each meeting, each phone call felt like another layer of her soul being chipped away. Her days were no longer her own. She would wake up early, rush through Mark's care, then race to Taylor's office, where she was nothing more than a pawn in a game she hadn't agreed to play. He had promised her everything: treatment for Mark, a new life. But as time wore on and realized that nothing came without a price. Every night, after returning from Taylor's office, and would sit by Mark's bedside, watching him sleep. His breathing was steady, but she could see the toll his illness had taken on his small body. The boy who had once been full of life was now frail, fragile, caught in the grip of a disease that no amount of money could cure. She had promised herself that she would do anything for him, anything to give him a fighting chance. But now, she wondered at what cost. She had been keeping her distance from Paul, afraid of his growing concern. But tonight, she couldn't help herself. She needed someone who understood her, someone who hadn't been blinded by the power of money and control. She picked up the phone and dialed his number. And Paul's voice was a mixture of relief and concern. "You okay?" "I don't know anymore, Paul. I'm not sure I can keep doing this," she said, her voice breaking. "I've lost myself. Everything I've done, every decision I've made, it's all for him, but I don't know what's left for me." There was a long pause before Paul spoke again, his voice quiet but filled with care. "You've always been strong, but this isn't you. You don't have to do this alone." And felt the tears welling up, but she fought them back. "I'm so lost, Paul. I don't know how to get out of this." Paul's words were firm. "You're not lost. You just need to find your way back. To yourself. And to Mark. Don't forget why you're doing this in the first place." As and hung up, a sense of clarity washed over her. She had always been strong. She had always known who she was. But somewhere along the way, in her desperation to save Mark, she had let herself fade into the background. It was time to take back control. Time to fight for herself. Time to make a decision that was hers and hers alone. The path ahead was unclear, but Anne knew that she could no longer afford to remain silent, and could feel the weight of her own despair as she moved through the motions of her daily routine. Mark's health was deteriorating. and it seemed that every visit to the doctor was a reminder that time was slipping through her fingers. She had lost herself in the need to protect him, to provide for him. But in doing so, she had become someone she barely recognized. Each day, Taylor's presence loomed larger, his requests more demanding. He didn't care about her, didn't see her as anything more than a tool for his own gain. But the coldness in his eyes never seemed to waver. He was powerful, untouchable, and had become just another one of his pawns in a game she didn't want to play anymore. That night, she stood at the window of her small apartment, watching the city below. The lights twinkled, but none of them brought her peace. She thought of Mark, his smile, his laughter, and the promises she had made to protect him. She couldn't betray him anymore. There was a knock on the door. It was Paul. His gentle face seemed like a fleeting memory of hope in the midst of everything. "You're not alone, Anne. You don't have to carry this burden by yourself." His words pierced the darkness in her heart, and realized for the first time in a long while that she had a choice. She didn't have to continue sacrificing everything for a life that wasn't even her own. "Thank you, Paul," she whispered, knowing that, with his support, she might just find the courage to fight back. The days passed in a blur, but Anne felt a shift in herself, a faint stirring of strength she had long buried. Mark's health continued to improve, but every doctor's visit felt like a countdown. The fragility of his life reminded her of her own vulnerabilities. Then came the message from Taylor's assistant. She was to meet him in his office once more. Anne's stomach churned at the thought, but there was no turning back. It was time to stand up. When she arrived, Taylor was already waiting, his eyes cold as ever. "And you know what's at stake. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." But this time, Anne didn't flinch. "I'm done," she said firmly, surprising even herself with the strength in her voice. "I'll find a way out, and I'll protect my son." Taylor's expression faltered, just for a moment, before he masked it with his usual arrogance. He hadn't expected her to fight back, but she had, and that was enough. As Anne walked out of his office, her heart pounded with a newfound resolve. She didn't know what would happen next, but she was no longer afraid. She was ready to reclaim her life and protect her son, no matter what, and sat by the window of her small apartment, the dim light casting long shadows across the room. Mark was asleep, his fever finally broken, but the quiet ache in Anne's heart refused to fade. She thought of Taylor, his power, his coldness, and how he had used her as a pawn for so long. But something inside her had shifted. She was tired of being afraid. She thought back to her first day working for him, how small and insignificant she had felt then, how desperate she had been to secure Mark's future. But now, that desperation was fading, replaced by a quiet, stubborn defiance. She wasn't just a mother anymore. She was a fighter. The knock on the door startled her, and her pulse quickened. It was Paul again. He had been coming by every day since she had made her decision, offering words of encouragement, a safe harbor in the storm. He had seen the cracks in her armor long before she had. And Paul's voice was soft, yet firm. "There's something you need to hear. You need to know the truth about Taylor. He's not who you think he is." And turned to face him, confusion flashing across her face. "What are you talking about? There's a reason he's been so cold to you. But it's not what you think. It's not because he doesn't care. It's because he's been keeping a secret. Something he can't let anyone find out." Anne's heart raced. Could it be? Was there something in Taylor's past that explained his distance, his cruelty? She felt a pang of curiosity, but fear held her back. She had her own battles to fight. She didn't have the luxury of getting caught in someone else's mess. "I don't know if I want to know, Paul," Anne whispered, her voice shaky. "I've had enough of secrets." But Paul's eyes were filled with urgency. "You need to understand it. It could change everything." The next day, Anne couldn't stop thinking about Paul's words. They haunted her, twisting in her mind like a puzzle she couldn't piece together. What secret could Taylor possibly be hiding? And why would Paul feel the need to tell her now? After everything, Mark's condition was still fragile, and every moment of her life felt like it was tethered to his well-being. But the thought of Taylor's secret gnawed at her. What if this secret was the key to everything? Later that afternoon, Anne made the decision to confront him. She had nothing left to lose. The next time Taylor called for her, She wouldn't hide. She wouldn't be the quiet, obedient employee. She would face him, ready to hear whatever he had to say. When she arrived at his office, Taylor was already there, his usual cold demeanor masking any trace of emotion. He barely looked up as she entered, and wasn't intimidated anymore. She had her own fight to win. "Taylor," she said, her voice steady but full of tension. "Paul told me you're hiding something. What is it? What's the truth?" For the first time since she had known him, Taylor's eyes flickered. There was a brief moment of hesitation, and he knew that this was it. This was the moment that would change everything. He sighed deeply, his voice soft but pained. "And there's something you don't know about me, something I've kept buried for years. It's not an excuse for how I've treated you, but I need you to understand. I never meant for you to get caught up in this." Anne's breath caught in her throat. She didn't know whether to feel angry or sad. But one thing was clear. This was just the beginning of a far more complicated story than she had ever imagined. And stood motionless, the words echoing in her mind like a distant storm. Taylor, the man who had dismissed her without a second thought, the one who had shown her nothing but coldness, was hiding something so deeply personal that it had been eating away at him for years. She felt a bitter wave of confusion rush over her. She had always known Taylor as a man of power, a businessman who took what he wanted and left behind nothing but destruction. But now, with the vulnerability in his eyes, she couldn't help but feel a flicker of empathy. "You've been running from your past, Taylor," and said, her voice quiet but firm. "But you can't keep running. Whatever it is, it's a part of you now." Taylor didn't respond immediately. His gaze dropped to the desk, his jaw clenched, and could see the struggle in his eyes, the weight of a man who had carried a secret for too long. For a moment, she almost felt sorry for him. But then she remembered Mark, the years of suffering she had endured to care for her son, the betrayal she had felt when Taylor had treated her like a mere tool. "You think you're the only one with scars?" And continued, her words more biting now, as the anger began to rise. "You've played me like a fool. All I've done is try to survive." There was a long silence between them, thick with unspoken words. Finally, Taylor exhaled, his voice a quiet admission. "I never meant to hurt you, Anne, but I had to. If you knew what I'd done, you'd hate me." Anne's heart pounded in her chest, the tension suffocating. She didn't know what he was talking about, but she could feel the gravity of it. "Tell me, Taylor. I'm done guessing." His eyes met hers, and for the first time, they were not filled with arrogance or indifference, but with something raw, fear, regret. "I lost someone I loved, and someone very close to me. And when I lost them, I lost everything. My business, my respect, my humanity. I became what I am today to bury the pain. But I can't do it anymore." Anne's breath caught in her throat. She had been expecting anger, blame, something to justify his cruelty. But this was different. This was pain. Anne's world tilted. The pieces of Taylor's cold, distant behavior suddenly made sense. He had built his empire on the ashes of a past he could never escape. The ruthlessness, the power plays, the decisions that crushed everyone in his path. It was all a shield to keep the pain at bay. She had been nothing more than another casualty in his desperate attempt to outrun his demons. But as his words sank in, something in and shifted. She wasn't the victim anymore. She had endured too much, sacrificed too much to let him keep manipulating her. Mark needed her to be strong, to be the mother he deserved, and she could no longer let Taylor's darkness cloud her future. "Is that why you've done everything you've done?" Anne asked, her voice steady but hard. "Because you're running from something?" Taylor nodded, a grimace of regret crossing his face. "Yes, but it's no excuse for the way I treated you. I know that now," and felt a surge of anger. But it wasn't the same anger that had consumed her before. This was different, fueled by a clarity that had been hard to find in the labyrinth of her grief and fear. "I don't need your pity, Taylor," she said firmly. "I don't need your apologies. What I need is for you to stop controlling my life. Stop using me as a pawn in your games." Taylor looked at her, the words hanging between them, unfinished, uncertain. And didn't wait for him to respond. She turned on her heel and walked out of his office, her heart pounding, her mind racing. Outside, the air was cooler, the sky a faint shade of gray. Anne's legs felt like lead, but there was a weight lifted from her chest. She had faced the man who had held so much power over her life, and she had walked away. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in years, she felt like she had a choice, and had never felt so torn in her life. The weight of everything Taylor had revealed, the vulnerability in his eyes, haunted her as she walked through the streets toward her apartment. Her heart felt heavy, torn between the desire to protect her son and the possibility that Taylor, despite his cold exterior, might not be the monster she had always believed him to be. She didn't want to feel sorry for him. She didn't want to forgive him. But the truth was, she couldn't ignore the connection they had. Both broken people, hiding behind walls built by pain, running from the past. It was too much to process in one breath, too much to untangle in a single moment. Back at her apartment, she found Mark sleeping on the couch, his small body curled into a tight ball, his face soft in slumber. Seeing him like this, so innocent, so full of hope despite everything, filled her with a determination she hadn't felt in years. She couldn't let anything stand in the way of his future. Not Taylor's dark past, not her own fears. She couldn't let the world keep knocking them down, and took a deep breath, a decision settling deep in her chest. Taylor had already taken so much from her life, her trust, her peace, her sense of safety. But she wasn't going to let him take her power, too. She would fight for her son, for their future, and if it meant walking away from everything that had entangled them, then that's what she would do. She would never be a pawn again. The following day, Anne walked into Taylor's office one last time. He looked up from his desk, his face marked by exhaustion and regret. She had expected him to try to say something, to apologize, but he didn't. There was no need. His silence spoke volumes, and in that silence, she found her strength. "I'm done, Taylor," Anne said, her voice clear, cutting through the air between them. "I'm done with the lies, the manipulation. My son needs me, and I need to be free of this." Taylor didn't move. His eyes darkened, but there was something else there, a trace of understanding. It seemed that, for the first time, he saw Anne for who she truly was, not just a pawn in his game, but a mother who would do anything for her child. "I'll pay for Mark's treatment," Taylor said quietly. "Whatever it takes." Anne's heart skipped a beat. The offer was more than she expected, but it wasn't about the money anymore. It wasn't about the things Taylor could give her. She had her own strength, her own power, and she would use it for her son, not for a man who had hurt her. "No," she replied firmly. "What I need is a life that isn't tied to you. A life where my son can grow up without the shadows of your mistakes hanging over us." She turned and walked out of his office, her head held high. As she left, she felt a sense of finality wash over her. She was free. That evening, as the sun set and painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, Anne and Mark stood at their apartment window, watching the world below. Mark's hand was small in hers, but in that moment, it was enough. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she felt ready to face it. A new beginning. No more chains. No more fear. Just the promise of tomorrow. In the end, Anne chooses freedom, reclaiming her strength and defying the shadows of her past. She walks away from everything that once held her captive, proving that sometimes the hardest choices are the ones that set us free. It's a powerful reminder that no matter how dark life gets, we always have the power to start anew for ourselves and the ones we love. If this story moved you, if it made you reflect on the power of choices and the courage to change, then comment below with your thoughts. Like if you believe in second chances, and share this message with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want to see more stories of transformation, don't forget to subscribe. You won't want to miss what comes next. Your journey to strength and renewal begins here.